The first thing I think we should understand about globalization, that it came into our lexicon, it came into our words when it was an advertising pitch, something that the advertisers wanted to do in order to sell more stuff or to think about how to sell more stuff around the world. So this came in, and then it was adopted by academics, by lots of people, and so it became very popular to the extent that it became, we might consider a fad word. Everybody's using it, and that's why it made me sad to hear how faddish it has been in your lives as well. That is to say, lots and lots of people are using it, but it's not very well defined. Fad words come in and they're used to explain things without actually explaining things. So if you go somewhere else and you see that they're drinking Coca-Cola, you say, globalization. Or if somebody comes in and you're like, where'd you come from? You say, globalization. So it's used to explain, or it's used to sort of explain a mood that we get when we see a McDonald's somewhere else, or somebody shows up here, or you can eat sushi at the Tokyo Tavern, and we think, it's used to explain, or it's used to tell us what is going on, but it doesn't really, it doesn't get to the specifics of those flows and why people are in the places where they are, because it's used as a kind of dismissive word. It's kind of like culture. Yeah, that's their culture. Globalization. So what I'd like to first urge you to do is, at least when we see the word globalization, be careful of a number of different ideas which I think are perhaps dangerous is a big word to use about words, but at least problematic. So the first thing that we'll try to get out of our heads is that globalization only happened a few days ago, or a few years ago, or since 1989. So that it's only a recent thing. But on the other hand, I want us to be careful of the idea that globalization, and our textbook actually starts with this sentence, which is something that I'm going to urge us to not do in a second. Globalization is a relatively new term used to describe a much older historical process that began with humans moving out of Africa to spread all over the world, which would mean that it started like either 1 million years ago or 70,000 years ago, depending on what your time frame is. But that would be way too long. So be careful of this idea that globalization has always been with us, because that doesn't work either. Be careful of this idea that only now, or only recently, are these isolated peoples coming into contact with each other. And if you want to help yourself, be careful with that idea. Go back and read something in anthropology that was written about 100 years ago, and it will say something like, these isolated peoples are increasingly coming into contact with each other. So this has been going on for, I'm going to argue about 400 or 500 years, but people were never isolated in this way anyway. Anyway, just be careful of that idea. Be careful of the idea that the world is always getting smaller, that this is an inevitable thing and the world is shrinking, 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 and it's a small and smaller world after all. We will talk about how the world doesn't always shrink like this. There are barriers put up to this idea before. And also be careful, and a lot of you, I think, we're good about this one, the idea that either globalization is a good thing or globalization is a bad thing. Of course, there are going to be different and unequal effects, and whether these processes are good or bad, it's difficult to tell. We can analyze the complexities, but be careful of trying to put some sort of overarching huge moral value on these complicated processes. So these are things that I want you to watch out for or be careful of, because, like I said, globalization came to us from the world of advertising and has often been very poorly or not at all defined. So I'm going to try to argue to you, and you can believe me or not, but that there are actually three different major phases of globalization. And today we're going to do phase 1 and phase 2, basically. I would say that if we want to think about when globalization begins as globalization, as interoceanic contact and people moving around in new and different ways, that you would have to pinpoint, around 1492 to around the year 1776. How can you pinpoint years like this? But, roughly around 1500 to around 1800, when you have this interconnection of peoples and really some really super important things happen during this time. In fact, in this class, we'll spend most of our class in that time period because very little is known about how important that time period was. There is a time period which we know more about because we learn a lot about it often in school, the time of the industrial revolution, the time of some of the great migrations of peoples from Europe into the Americas. And so we might call this a sort of boom period of globalization, roughly from 1800 to 1900, what some historians call the long 19th century. It took me a long time to actually realize that when people said the 19th century, they were talking about the years from 1800 to 1900. And that when they said the 20th century, they were talking about the years from 1900 to 2000, and that we live in the 21st century now. But that's the way it works. That's the way they count things. So the long 19th century, and the reason they call it that is because they start it with sort of the revolution, the American independence, and the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which both occurred in around 1776, and end it with the end of World War I, or what was known as the Great War, because they didn't really know that there was going to be a World War II yet. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars, right? Now, what I also want to try to convince you of is, again, the world doesn't just get smaller and smaller and smaller, that there was a time period in there from, say, the 1920s to the 1970s in which people started to much more believe in the notion of a nation, a border, a passport, that certain people shouldn't be able to move around anymore, that certain goods and services and finance shouldn't be able to move. And so all during this time, there was a lot of hardening of the idea of nationalism and national borders. And so when it comes to globalization part 3, which we'll do in the next class, that arrives around the 1980s and that most people think of as globalization, for the people who grew up during the 1920s through the 1970s, this came as like a shock. It's like, oh my God, what's happening? My world is being turned upside down. The truth of the matter is, one could argue that we're not even at the level of globalization that we saw in the 1910s or around there. We're not even there. But because human memory is very short and human historical memory is shorter yet, this was felt as this big surprise when in fact we can look back at what was going on before. Now, in recent years, people have begun to question whether globalization is still going on. So from around, 2010 or so, there's been a rise in what we call ethno-nationalism. So instead of this idea that everybody's coming together, everybody seems to be breaking apart. The some economists have talked about trade slowing down, and so they coined this other weird phrase called slowbalization, which is the idea that, yeah, we're slowly becoming global, but it's moving at a snail's pace. And one of the other things that has happened is that there's been a real divide in terms of internet, in terms of all kinds of things between China and the United States. And so there seems to be these, it's hard to say right now. Well, we don't know yet, but there seems to be these divisions being put into place. And all of this happened before, of course, COVID, which I think one of you asked, well, what has COVID done to globalization? And that's a very good question, because on the one hand, it makes us aware that there's this international thing that's affecting everybody. But on the other hand, it slams the door on all kinds of international travel and trade and being able to go where you might want to go. So it's been a pretty huge slowdown. Again, we'll talk about this more, I think, in the next class, about the fact that in some ways our hugest problems, you might say, climate change, inequalities, the health inequalities that are made manifest by these kinds of diseases, are obviously global in nature. We need global solutions to them, but we're living at a time when increasingly people are, or many people are, trumpeting their own national borders and national ideas about them. So this is what I'm going to argue is our time period of globalization, which is not a uniform thing and is not eternal either. Now, before we get into the roots of globalization, I want to make sure we know why we should care about this. Who cares, right? Why should we learn about this history stuff? It's just a bunch of stuff that happened, or as one person famously put it, what is history? One damn thing after another. So why should we care? The first thing that I'll tell you, I hope, is that a lot of these facts, a lot of these things that we are going to learn about in today's class are both crucial, but we never learned them in school. They never got taught to us. I try to give you these facts in many of my classes. So I'm hoping every so often when I ask a question, somebody's going to say, aha, I know the answer to that. It's kind of like a quiz today. We'll see. These things kind of slide out of our memory fast because we're taught them like once and then we forget, or usually none times. So the first thing is just to get some crucial facts onto the table. The second thing is to figure out why we are where we are and why other people are in the place where they are. Sometimes at the beginning of this class, I think I've imposed this on you before, I play a song by Bob Marley called Buffalo Soldier, which is about the African American regiments that basically helped subdue the west of the United States in the expansion of the United States westward, which is an interesting issue because some of these African American regiments were, of course, fighting against people who were indigenous or Native American in that area. But what Bob Marley is saying in this song is that, if you know about these things, if you know about why people were placed in the places they were and brought to places they might not have wanted to be and made to do things they may not have wanted to do, then you wouldn't have to ask me who I am. And this happens a lot around the world, is that people act like, somebody shouldn't be speaking Spanish in Colorado. And you're like, Colorado, man, Colorado is named by the Spaniards. How come we can't speak Spanish in Colorado? That was part of the Spanish Empire. So people get moved around, or people get put into different places for very good reasons. And if you know about this history, you know who you are and you know why you got to where you are and why somebody else might have a reason to be there too. As long as I've mentioned the Tokyo Tavern. Has anybody ever been to the Tokyo Tavern? No. It's been hard to get there. The Tokyo Tavern. Sometimes I send students down there to do a little field work there, to talk about what it is to be in a restaurant. When you hear the language that people are speaking in the Tokyo Tavern, what are they speaking? The wait staff. Yes. That's what we would think, but there's no way they're speaking Japanese. You know why they're not speaking Japanese? Because Japan is super, super rich and their sushi is super, super expensive. And if you can make sushi as a Japanese person, you have not come to Oneonta. No way. No, no, no. They are not speaking Japanese. Actually, several of the workers used to live in the house next to ours. For the most part, they're speaking Chinese. And so it's a very interesting thing that has happened where people who speak, people from China or from Korea have, sushi is kind of a part, they've adopted those parts of their cuisine and are sort of selling it to Americans in the same way that we were sold Chinese food a long time ago, which was not really at all from China, but was developed in some ways for American taste. But yes, just in case, I don't know, maybe every so often you'll see someone speaking Japanese and making sushi, but you are probably paying a lot of money for that, man. I don't know if I've ever seen it. Probably, maybe in New York City, because boy, if you can, that is some good stuff. This Tokyo Tavern is great too, don't get me wrong, but it's not, they're not speaking Japanese. All right. The third reason why this is super important to us is that all the ideas that we have about, how people are, some of the stuff we've been talking about before, that people come in certain race groups, that there are these things called ethnic groups, the ideas about gender that we were talking about the last class, and that somebody reminded us the Europeans didn't like two-spirit people around. All of these ideas come to us or are an inheritance of this era. The idea of race, that people are naturally supposed to be in certain categories and that those categories can lead to freedom or enslavement, very much a part of the colonial period of life. And the whole idea that that there are nations, I mean, this is actually a fairly recent idea, that people belong to nations, that everyone should have a nation, that nations have borders or boundaries around them. I mean, it's not that people didn't have walls and borders and all those things, but the idea that the world is divided up into these little places called nations and that each nation deserves its own nation state is not something that people thought about, say, 1,000 years ago. I mean, people had very different ideas of why you should be able to move around. So it's kind of interesting when globalization is described as nations coming together, and it's like, no, the whole idea of a nation comes to us from globalization. So it can't be that globalization is nations coming together. Anyway. Fourth and finally, why do we care? I saved this for last because this is something that maybe you don't need to care about because you're just in an anthropology class. But the whole discipline of anthropology, the whole academic exercise of anthropology doesn't make any sense if you don't know what happened between about 1500 to about 1900. And so that's because anthropology itself doesn't come out as an academic discipline until around 1900. That's when you have Boas and Malinowski and different people that we've talked about. So it's a very young academic discipline. And when the people who were first going to study other people went out to do their studying of other things, it's very important to know that the people they were studying were not, as some of them wanted to believe, isolated and primitives, but often people who had already been transformed and displaced by these earlier processes. And so when in anthropology we argue for the importance of culture instead of race, for example, and we argue against stereotypes about human beings and their inferiority and superiority, all of those, most of those stereotypes come exactly out of this period. So, 3 reasons that we should care about this history: 4 crucial facts, knowing who we are, the categories of modern life, and then the 4th reason is that anthropology makes no sense without them. So our whole discipline, our whole textbook doesn't make sense unless we know this. All right. I wanted to start with the Africa stuff because, as we read, our textbook begins this with this idea that globalization began with humans moving out of Africa to spread all over the world. So the first thing I want to tell you is that, yes, almost all of human evolution happens in Africa. And after that, people leave or go into different parts of the world from Africa. But I just want to note those green arrows there, they also go back into Africa. So I want to first make sure we know that when we say this whole idea of out of Africa, it's often made to sound like people were just cruising out and leaving everybody else behind. Actually, there was migration in and out of the continent. And then people made it over into Australia, India, the North, into the Americas. We've been reading about, there's some new evidence that this certainly settled by at least 15,000 years ago, humans all over the habitable world. But I want to be clear here that it was exactly the fact that we were bipedal, migrating, interacting, trading with each other creatures within the huge, huge, huge continent of Africa, which is an enormous place to be in, that made us human. We don't need to call that globalization. That's just what people do. They contact each other, they interact, they trade, and they migrate. And that this migration, trade, and interaction is what made people able to inhabit all of the world as of around 15,000 years ago. Again, we don't need to call that globalization because that's just being human. And if you became too isolated, if your group got cut off from other people and you weren't able to trade and interact with anyone, then you often ended up dying and you would no longer exist. So people were always in interaction with the groups next to them. They would intermarry, they would interact, they would go and live peacefully with each other. They would fight each other sometimes too, that is true. But the point of the matter is, everybody was aware of at least their neighbors around the world. So this is not, I guess again, I'm arguing against the idea that this migration, trade, and if globalization is just migration, trade, and interaction, then let's just call it migration, trade, and interaction, and that's what makes us human. There's no need to distinguish separately the idea of globalization. So this is a little bit different way of looking at the world. I found this map. Usually we either put the United States in the center of the world, which is very scary, or we put the United States on the left side. So there's a more Pacific-centered map, but it helps us out. So we know here that people are in Africa and they go down into Australia and they go up here into Europe and they go over here into Asia, and they eventually go down here into the Americas, and then they're everywhere. Everywhere, people doing their hunting and gathering thing. Is about 15,000 years ago. They're interacting with each other. At the same time, certain places do become relatively continentally cut off. So when people come to Australia, and there aren't a lot of things that there was never anything that you could really domesticate in Australia. So they continued to develop their hunting and gathering techniques, but they were relatively cut off from other groups for a while. Now, again, Australia is a huge place, and so they had plenty of time to roam around and make contact with each other, but they were relatively cut off from here. And people in sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit relative. I mean, you could still do trade and stuff and up and down the coast, but in some ways a little bit isolated. And then people in the Americas, of course, are basically cut off by these oceans from Eurasia. And they're also in some ways basically cut off from each other. So that, for example, there's no evidence that the Inca Empire in South America was in contact with the Aztec Empire in what is now Mexico. So I mean, again, these are huge land areas, and people were in contact all over those land areas with each other, but they'd be relatively continentally cut off. So in a book called Questioning Collapse, which is actually a book that is aimed at the Jared Diamond history of the world against it, a couple of archaeologists talk about, if we looked in past history at the most powerful and largest cities in the world, where would they be? And what they say, these archaeologists, is if we looked at about 1,500 years ago, so 500 in the Common Era, we used to call AD, 500 AD Common Era, those powerful and largest cities would be in what is now Mexico, what is now Italy, and what is now China. And then they said, well, let's fast forward 500 years. At about 1,000 years ago, 1,000 Common Era, the biggest or the most powerful cities would be in what is now Peru, what is now Iraq, I think I got that right, and what is now Central Asia. Fortunately, Timur's not here to let me know if I got that one right, but I think that's pretty right. I then wanted to add in a couple different cities. That's why I wanted to know where Haley went. Cordoba, Spain. There's now Spain, become a very important big city around the year 1000, 1000. And Cairo. Cairo in 1340 was the largest city, about 500,000 people, the largest city west of China. I want to put that, they don't mention those two, but I thought it would be important to add them. And at about 1500 Common Era, about 500 years ago, the largest, most powerful cities were in China, India, Turkey. So, as I mentioned, Australia is not an urban place at this time. Sub-Saharan Africa has some big populations and urban settlements, but is not part of the most powerful cities of the world at this time. North America, some people talk about Cahokia, but not much going on there. Oh, sorry, I'm doing this for myself, but not for you. There's Australia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Cahokia maybe, but it kind of rises and falls. Where else is missing here? A powerful place today that is missing from this map. Leah. Huh? The Arctic and Antarctic, yeah, people up there are not not living in urban areas. They're kind of out of it up there. They're doing their own cool things. Lots of hunting and sophisticated hunting and techniques, but they're not in the largest cities of the world, and they still aren't. What's missing here? Where else are we missing? Yeah.
From that time or like today?
The places that are powerful today that are not here back then. Yeah, the whole United States, obviously, yes. New York City is not there, right? Where else? Most of Western Europe. Yeah, I threw in Cordoba because, well, we'll see why in a second. London, nothing. Paris, kind of something. Most of Northern Europe was not really part of this scene. I mean, they were peripheral to this. They knew about what was going on because they were connected land-wise to these other places. So they knew that there were things going on, but in terms of the Northern European powers that would rise, they were relatively peripheral to much of world history for all this time. I guess I also wanted to throw in that Japan and Tokyo and that's a whole other story which we should learn, but we're not going to learn in this class. So we have this places in Northern Europe which would later become hugely important, of course, but in this part of time they're not a very big part of world history. Now, if you knew about these really cool places, if you knew about them, were connected to them, the people in these parts of Europe really wanted that stuff. They really wanted silk, and they really wanted spices, and they really wanted to be connected to this whole Asian world over here with these powerful and large cities. And for many hundreds, thousands of years, there was enormous trade routes. We've seen them in this class, called the Silk Road, where they traded spices and silk all along this place, and eventually it would get her over into Europe. And what started to happen is that those trade routes, at a certain point in time, at about 500 or 600 years ago, began to get cut off. And a lot of this has to do with the story of the expansion of the Islamic Empire, which expands out to be one of the largest at the year, again, as we saw, some of the largest and most dynamic cities are in Turkey around 1500 AD, which expands out through North Africa, takes over Sicily for a time, all of what is now the Iberian, what we call the Iberian Peninsula, what are now the countries of Spain and Portugal and even part of France for a while. The Pyrenees is where they get stopped. But they had a huge empire, a hugely important empire, which was responsible for preserving some of the Greek texts from before, giving us a lot of advancements in mathematics. We wonder about why Arabic numerals are so helpful to us. If you've ever tried to do long division with Roman numerals, you know how great it is that that the Islamic Empire helped give us the Arabic numerals, because boy, that is not fun at all. So mathematics, also the technology to produce and grow sugarcane. The word for sugar, azúcar, comes to us through Arabic, through Spanish. So that was promoted across this range. A lot of, for those of you who are Spanish speakers, a lot of words and other things come ojalá, of course, is, you know, may Allah grant that, or in contemporary Spanish, I just hope, I hope. So we have the expansion of the Islamic Empire, which was really seen at the time as one of the most sophisticated places, a place that people wanted to be in and imitate. But they also started to cut off those trade routes. It was getting more difficult for the Europeans to get over to Asia and to get those spices and to get that silk. So what do you do if you're trying to get to Asia and your land routes have been cut off? Yes. Go by sea. You got to look for a way around. You got to look for some way else to go. And so especially the people in this part of the world, in Spain and Portugal, or the places that would become Spain and Portugal, start trying to sail around. They start trying to sail west, and they especially start trying to sail around, around Africa. And so what happens is, and this is the Iberian Peninsula in 1491. And as you can see, in 1491, they have begun to retake the land and the political control of these places. In fact, Portugal was one of the first to sort of retake this area, what people would later call, I'm not sure if they called it at the time, the Reconquista, or the reconquest, because they were gradually pushing out the Islamic Empire from this territory. So you had Portugal, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon starting to form themselves and starting to do that sailing around thing, that ocean faring thing, to try and get around and get to the good stuff in the East. If you were living in the Iberian Peninsula in 1491, and then it came to be 1492, what would be the most important thing that happened to you in 1492? If someone gets this right, I'm going to be so happy. It mean I've done my job. Yes, Haley.
I know, like Columbus.
Columbus is over. Columbus is over here in 1492. He can't get back. If you're there, you don't know about Columbus yet. He hasn't been able to send a message. He'll get back, but it's going to be maybe really late in 1492. Remember, Columbus Day happens in October. He's sailing back now. He's trying to get there. He doesn't actually even know that what he's found, right? He's still calling them the Indies. That's how we get the name of the West Indies. Yes, we were taught about 1492. If you were living here, there would be a couple huge events, or, you know, things that would change, perhaps change your life. The first was the fall of the Kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim caliphate in Europe. And with the fall of the Kingdom of Granada, also the end of a relatively tolerant period between Christians and Muslims in this area. They were basically said that they expelled them. They also expelled or convert the Jews. And so this is the time of, you know, the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition. You had to either leave or convert to Christianity. So what was once, in some ways, you might consider it a multi-religious or multicultural area of the world, begins to think of itself as a Christian area of the world. Again, this was not true before. And in 1492, it is not a coincidence that we have the fall of the Kingdom of Granada the last Muslim caliphate and the beginning of the forced conversion or expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So yes, Columbus, we do need to talk about Columbus. So the people from Portugal were really the place to be if you wanted to sail. You wanted to have that Portuguese technology. They were sailing around the coast of Africa. They were pushing westward. That's where you wanted to be. And Columbus, who was originally from Genoa, what is now Italy, really wanted to get money from the Portuguese because, boy, they had the best stuff, the best sailing. And so he kept asking the Portuguese for money to fund his voyages. Does anybody know why the Portuguese didn't give Columbus any money? Jonathan.
If I remember correctly, Columbus believed the Earth was only, I think it was like 2,000 miles wide, and the Portuguese, that was very wrong. 21,000.
Yes, beautiful. And I didn't even tell you that. Somebody else did. Who told you that? That is fab. Yeah, absolutely. Columbus had an idea. So just to spell a couple of other ideas, the Portuguese and Columbus and everybody who knew anything knew that the world was round. Everybody knew that. Columbus had calculated that the world, he thought it was very small. He's like, we can get there from here. Just give me some money and I'm going west. And then I'll end up in the east. The Portuguese had correctly calculated that there was no way the world was that small. They had calculated a larger and in fact correct world. Neither of them knew that there was going to be a whole land mass over there, but the Portuguese were like, no, you're not going to get there from here. We're going to stick with our thing, which is going south. But the Spanish, for their own weird reasons, they were willing to take a bet on this crazy guy. And he starts sailing and finds this other stuff. Now, I think I've told you this before, but most historians say, we can ask Jonathan if this is true, that if it would have been for Columbus, somebody else would have done this within 10 or 15 years. So the fact that it was Columbus is really kind of a historical accident. Somebody from either the Portuguese or the Spanish sailors were already pushing west. But I want to pause here a little bit on the Portuguese, because the Portuguese Empire is just you have this very small, tiny country in Europe, which becomes a huge, basically oceanic empire. I mean, it eventually takes over what is now Brazil, but the land, they weren't very interested in land. They were interested in trading, seafaring, and getting stuff from different places. But, it was an empire, one of the longest and largest empires, which really, I mean, it lasted from 1415 to the last handover of Portuguese Macau, which who even knew there was such a thing over in China. They were sailing over Japan. They had places all through in India, different trading posts. Was only handed over about 20 years ago. And I say this because sometimes, I don't know if you've seen the Brazilian president, Bolsonaro, and how you're like, how did this person get so bad, right? I mean, it just doesn't make sense, but it kind of makes sense if you think about the empire of the Portuguese and their ideas. I mean, this is some of the origins of these ideas about native peoples and indigenous peoples come to us from this age of the Portuguese Empire. So we have the Portuguese. I mentioned that because they don't get mentioned enough in some ways, but there are a couple things that happen when in the Americas after that, which are hugely important to world history. One of them is is the discovery. So the Spaniards oftentimes were obviously looking for gold, because gold was an easy thing to well, it wasn't easy, but it was worth a lot, and you could buy a lot of spices and silk with it. And if you didn't have much else to give to the people in Asia, you could at least, they did like the gold that you could give them. So they were often looking for gold in the Americas. But what they eventually found the most of was silver. And there were some huge, the biggest place of silver was a place called Potosi, which according to Chris Lane, the historian, provided half of the world's silver for a century. And so they extracted an enormous amount of silver from these mines, and that silver fed into the world economy, all those trade routes and things that we've been talking about. And so at the time, Potosi became one of those huge and dynamic cities. It was in its heyday larger than London, larger than Paris. People came here from all over the world, different parts of Spain, different parts of Europe. Some of the people who were being expelled from Spain came here to trade. Some people have called it the first city of capitalism, because it generated all this silver and all this wealth. Where is Potosi? Anybody ever been there? Where is it? Here we have the first city of capitalism, bigger than Paris and bigger than London. Where is it? Jonathan?
I want to say like Colombia or Venezuela.
You want to say Colombia and Venezuela. You've just said it, so you've done well in saying that. You're on the right track. Go further. Sean?
Bolivia.
Bolivia. Ah, Google. Thank you. Or you knew that already.
No, I knew it, but I looked it up.
Excellent. Yes, I took out these words so we wouldn't know it. You're getting close. It was in the Andes, the mountains. It was in it's a city in highland Bolivia. I once took some students there on a J term for a few days. And no one has ever been back. I mean, it's a very difficult place to live. It's about 11,000 feet high, and it's really cold, and it's difficult to live there. But if you have a lot of silver, you would come there. This is a painting. We took a picture of this painting in the museum there by Gaspar Miguel de Berrio in 1758, at a time when many of the places around here were nothing. You have this modern city layout. If you go there today, you can still see the various architectures from different parts of Spain and other parts of the world that were there. And there's that big hill of silver behind you. You can still have people prospecting for silver. You can go on tours of it. It's something. There's a picture from the museum there where you have the Virgin Mary, who has become a hill of silver and enabling the Spaniards to dominate the world, which is something. Again, we've never heard of this place. Not only have we not heard of it, it is very probable there's different ideas for where we got the dollar sign. You know that funny sign on our bills, the dollar sign? But the best story about that, it seems to be a remnant or a tribute to the Potosi Mint, because this was the Potosi Mint sign. And not only was it the Potosi Mint sign, it was that when the United States, we were doing our revolutionary thing, nobody wanted to take the American money because they thought it was worthless, until they said, our money is backed with what they called Spanish pesos, which were silver pesos from Potosi. And so once they did that, they would take their money because it was backed by the peso. So if you can imagine the US dollar being backed by the peso, that's where we were a few hundred years ago. For some, I don't know if those of you who are maybe old like me, you may remember people talking about 2 bits or 4 bits or 6 bits or $1, and that refers to being able to cut a Spanish peso into various bits. And so 2 bits would be equal to a quarter, but only old people talk like that. Nowadays, probably all gone. So we have the silver coming out from, there were also some very important silver mines in Mexico as well, but much of it coming here from Bolivia. The other hugely important thing that goes on here is what is usually known as the transatlantic slave trade. I've been trying to tell us that we're not going to use that word, so I'm going to try and change it to the transatlantic enslavement trade, or the trade in enslaved Africans being moved mostly into the Americas from Africa. This is a map that shows kind of in scale where most people went during this time. What do you notice about this? Yeah, Jonathan.
A lot of people were being moved to Brazil.
A lot of people were being moved into Brazil. Yeah, just to give you a sense of the numbers, Brazil is the largest destination for enslaved Africans. 4 million, about 35% of the trade. So yeah, a lot of people being moved into Brazil. What else do you notice? I would also say an almost equal number being moved into the Caribbean. Cuba, Saint-Domingue, Jamaica, Barbados. Well, let's take a look at those numbers again. The Spanish Empire, including Cuba and the British West Indies and the French West Indies, actually, if you totaled all of those together, that would be about 6 million. What about the United States? Pretty small. In fact, there are some pretty small islands. I mean, Cuba is a big island, but they're pretty small islands that got more enslaved Africans than the whole United States. Again, look at those numbers. The United States accounts for, I mean, now obviously the trade in enslaved Africans was hugely important to the United States. Our whole history as a country is really unthinkable without it. But in terms of the world historical importance of where people went, 500,000, less than 5%. What the heck were all these people being moved to do? Yeah, sugarcane, exactly. Most people who were forcibly moved out of Africa went into sugar plantations. And so we have, in our idea of the United States, we learn about cotton, and that's important. It's not that it's not important, but the major demographic lever, perhaps the biggest demographic mover in the history of the world, is the cultivation of sugarcane. And that's where they went. So this is a postcard and a little quote about the plantations of Saint-Domingue, which is a small island in the Caribbean, which was, hugely one of the richest places, a colony of France eventually, a colony of France which was producing sugar, much sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton as Brazil and Jamaica combined. Amazing place to be, so much wealth. Where is Saint-Domingue? Is that Haiti? It is. Saint-Domingue is Haiti, which was at its time producing an enormous amount of sugar and coffee and all those things. The island of Hispaniola, which is actually where Columbus first landed, the island of Hispaniola was later divided into Saint-Domingue and what would later become the Dominican Republic. And Saint-Domingue is Haiti. And you know, another thing that we usually don't learn is that we have the American Revolution in 1776. The second independent country in the Americas is Haiti. It's the only site of a successful slave and revolution by people of color, which overthrows a colonial government and establishes an independent country. It's enormously important in world history, and most of us never learn about it. Here's another postcard from Saint-Domingue, planting the sugar cane. I want to just mention here that a lot of, well, the anthropologist Sidney Mintz in particular has argued that many of the plantation processes to make sugar and to make sure sugar was being manufactured so that it could be transported would later become a template for the factory system in the Industrial Revolution. There's Saint-Domingue, which is connected to New Orleans, which is part of the French Americas. So what happened is that Napoleon, he was a very interested in power kind of guy, and he was interested in establishing not just a European empire, but an American empire as well. But what happened is with the Haitian Revolution, his most profitable place goes away. And he tried to reconquer them, but they drove the French army into the sea. And so, you know, you have the Haitian Revolution, at which point he sort of lost interest in all this land. So again, we all know about the Louisiana Purchase, but very few of us learned that if it hadn't been for the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon probably wouldn't have wanted to sell that land. It would have been a lot harder to get there, which would have changed the whole course of US history. Again, something we don't learn about that much. All right, so to summarize, how are we doing? We're doing great. Globalization 1, the beginnings. We have this reshaping of the world that takes place long before anthropology or anybody ever talks about things, which is the establishment of these transoceanic and land empires, the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire. You have all this silver coming in from Potosi that's revitalizing and igniting different world trade routes, which were there, but they got revved up with the silver. You have sugar plantations. Before these sugar plantations, azúcar, or sugar, was something that you had to spend a lot of money for it. It was an exotic spice. But the plantations and plantation-based slavery, mostly in the Caribbean and in Brazil, takes this sugar stuff and makes it into a mass-produced commodity, which you can then combine with coffee, you can combine with cacao, you can get, you know, various sweet drinks that give you a lot of calories and a lot of caffeine. And so it's very difficult to imagine, and I'm now just going to skip over the Industrial Revolution because we all learn about the stupid Industrial Revolution all the time, but it's difficult to imagine how the Industrial Revolution that produces the big cities of Northern Europe would have ever happened without the silver going into it, without the labor supply, without those laborers being able to drink sugar flavored tea and beverages and get all those calories into them. But as the North basically industrialized, a lot of these places, Haiti, the Caribbean, Brazil, Bolivia, Potosi, got left behind. They remained as extractive economies, and then we forgot about them. And so by the time you have, by the time of the 19th century, the world had been arranged as this hierarchy of races and so, well, I guess I would say a racialized hierarchy. And so again, this is why it's important for anthropology, because here you have this reorganization of the world and all these stereotypes about where these races belong and are ordered. And then you have this idea of racial determinism, which is the idea that this is just a natural order of things, because we'd forgotten about, or the way in which people in what we would call now the global South were crucial for creating this modern world. So that's the beginnings of globalization. A lot of people, sometimes people, believe that globalization then booms and you have this this kind of peak of globalization around 1910. In 1910, in the United States, almost 15% of people who lived here were foreign born. That is still the highest percentage that has ever been recorded. So people get upset about immigrants. That's still the peak right there. There was lots of international exports, connections. People in all different kinds of countries were trading things around and kind of knew about each other. People were able to move around a lot, didn't need passports. No, not a big deal. And of course, we have the World War I. Armistice Day, today, the 11th of November. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. I mean, yeah, people kept fighting, but it's good to think about it. Armistice Day, the 11th of November. So we have this, up until about 1910 or so, you have this kind of globalization, you might say, peaks out or it reaches a high point. Now, I don't know if I want to call this, and that's why I put a question mark there. I don't know if I want to call the 1930s to the 1970s deglobalization, because it's not exactly that things just go backwards, but we'll just, things change. So in the 1920s, 1930s, that period, there's a lot of the immigration restrictions get put in place, Asian Exclusion Act. The people who were sort of in an ambiguous situation when they arrived were, around World War II or so, become assimilated into the white category of things. We could spend a lot of time on that, but that's another time. Also in the 1930s with the Great Depression, there were a lot of people from Mexico who were living in all kinds of places, including Chicago and Detroit. But basically people started blaming the Mexicans for the economic downturn and tried to put them back. And so, after that, you had a lot of people who were basically expelled from the United States. When people were brought back into the United States, it was under a defined labor program. So you'd come in for the summers, you'd have to pick your crops, and then you'd have to go back. They then ended that Bracero program, which was in part responsible for the rise in what we call illegal immigration, because a lot of people were just looking for the jobs that they had before, but now were unable to do because that legal program had ended. You also have during this time the revving up of what is sometimes called Fordist production, the factory production, both in capitalist countries, but also in communist countries. So the Soviets were very enamored with factory production. So they believed that they were going to be able to do it better than the capitalists if they just put their minds to it. So they were very intensely industrializing. And so during this time, whether you lived in what we call the first world, or what we call the second world, the communist world, or even the third world, people started being very interested in establishing a national border, a national economy, a national identity, and those kinds of ideas and identities revved up. So that if you look at 1970, you're down to from almost 15% in 1910, you're down to under 5% of US residents are foreign born, which is the lowest ever recorded. So, I mean, imagine if you know, I mean, that's why people get so surprised, because 1970 was in some ways a strange low point of immigration. And in 1954, we had celebrated Armistice Day, like many other parts of the world. But in 1954, Armistice Day, which you might call an international celebration, was changed to Veterans Day. Now, of course, I'm not going to get down on Veterans Day, but you can see the progression that has happened here, or the change that has been made. You know, we're not celebrating armistice and peace and the war to end all wars. We're celebrating national service. And so this was under Eisenhower. They came and they wanted Veterans Day, and so I said, well, Armistice Day, we'll get rid of that. And so when what most people think of as globalization, which I'm going to call globalization part 3, comes to us in the 1980s, people are like, oh my God, what's happening? Why are these people here? Where did the Coca-Cola come from? And it comes as a shock to people, in part because of what had happened over this period, that people had sort of been incorporated into their national identities. And much of the politics of today has been brought to us by people who grew up during around 1970 or so, when there were very few, it was a very low proportion of foreign-born residents. And so, yes, they have weird attitudes about the world because, you know, if you had grown up maybe in the 1910s, this would not be unusual. But if you grew up in the 1970s, you might think the world was coming to an end. You needed to go back to somewhere. And so that's what we'll talk about in the Tuesday's class, the shock of the new. All right, folks, thank you for tolerating.